I arrived at Hollow Pines Lodge on a drizzly October evening, my nerves tangled in knots. Nestled deep in the forests of Maine, the lodge was a sprawling relic of 19th-century grandeur that had seen better days. Weathered shingles clung stubbornly to its steep roof, and the windows glinted faintly under the dim yellow porch lights. This was my first night as the new night manager. At 23, fresh out of college, I had no illusions of grandeur. The job seemed straightforward. Check in guests, keep the lobby tidy, and ensure no one broke into the wine cellar. A place my predecessor had cryptically warned me to avoid. Don't go poking around down there, Mr. Warwick, the day manager, had said during my interview. Old stories and all that. Just leave it be. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors, I was met with the scent of aged wood and lavender polish. The lobby was almost empty, save for a couple lounging by the stone fireplace. The receptionist, Claire, offered a warm smile as she handed me a set of keys and a battered notebook labeled night logs. "This is yours now," she said. "Oh, and keep an eye on room 303. They always complain about strange noises." "Strange noises?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Probably the pipes." She shrugged, though her smile faltered for a second. "Anyway, good luck." By 11 p.m., I was alone. The rain intensified, tapping against the tall windows in rhythmic urgency. I busied myself with the logs, noting various peculiarities from the past month. Room 212 complained of flickering lights. Guest in 101 claimed their toothbrush moved overnight. The lodge creaked with an unsettling regularity, each sound amplified by the silence. I told myself it was the age of the building. Old wood and cold nights didn't mix well. At around midnight, I heard a faint noise from the far end of the hall. A whispering sound. I glanced up, heart quickening. The lobby was still empty. Shrugging it off, I chalked it up to the wind, which now howled through the surrounding pines. Then came the thud. It was low and deliberate, echoing faintly from upstairs. I froze. Perhaps it was the guest in 303? Or maybe someone had tripped. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the stairs. "Routine check," I muttered under my breath, my voice a poor substitute for actual courage. The second floor was dimly lit, the sconces casting long shadows across faded wallpaper. At the far end of the hallway, room 303's door stood ajar. The hairs on my arms bristled. "Hello?" I called out, forcing steadiness into my voice. No response. I edged closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling. Peering into the room, I saw no one. The bed was untouched, the linens pristine. However, the window was wide open, rain pooling on the hardwood floor. "That's strange," I whispered. Shutting the window, I noticed something odd. A set of muddy footprints leading from the window to the door, then vanishing entirely into the hall carpet. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crack. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty, but the force of the door slamming sent a draft whistling through the air. My flashlight's beam wavered as I stepped toward the door. My trembling fingers reached for the knob, half expecting resistance, but it turned smoothly. Back in the hallway, silence reigned, save for the faint hum of the lodge's central heating. I peered both ways down the corridor. No one. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself that the wind or the old hinges must have caused the door to slam. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The muddy footprints, the window wide open in the rain. It didn't add up. I returned to the lobby, grabbing the night logs again. Flipping through the pages, I searched for any mention of room 303. There were plenty. Guest in 303 complained of hearing whispers in the walls. 303 reported objects moving during the night, lamp, chair. Guest checked out early, refusing to stay another night in 303. Claimed to see a figure at the window. My pulse quickened as I read further. One entry was smudged but legible enough. "Do not place guests in 303 until investigation is complete. See Warwick for details." I pushed the book aside, staring out the rain-drenched windows. The pines loomed like silent sentinels, their tops lost in the stormy darkness. Who had decided the investigation was complete? Clearly, no one. The hours ticked on uneventfully, and I tried to convince myself that nothing had really happened. By 3 a.m., the rain had tapered off to a misty drizzle, and I decided to patrol the lodge one last time. I started in the basement, where the wine cellar lurked. The heavy iron door was locked, just as Mr. Warwick had promised it would be. I wasn't planning to linger, but something drew my gaze to the small frosted window near the ceiling. The faint outline of a handprint was visible on the glass. It was too high for anyone to have touched it from inside, but the idea that it came from outside was somehow worse. Hurrying upstairs, I made my way to the third floor. The hall was eerily quiet, the sconces now casting their faint glow in an unsettling amber hue. As I approached 303, I stopped in my tracks. The door was wide open again. "Hello?" My voice echoed faintly down the hall. No answer. I hesitated before stepping inside. The footprints were back, fresh and glistening with moisture. They led from the window to the center of the room, where they abruptly stopped. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air. A faint whisper tickled my ear. My breath hitched, and I spun around. But the room was empty. The whisper came again, louder this time. It was unmistakable, a voice low and raspy. "Leave." I bolted from the room, my legs carrying me down the hall and back to the lobby before I even realized I was running. The air in the lobby felt oppressive, heavy, and I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. I refused to look back as I sat down at the desk, gripping the edge so hard my knuckles turned white. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first rays of sunlight finally crept through the lodge windows, I grabbed my bag and waited for Claire to arrive. She greeted me with her usual bright smile, but it faltered when she saw my face. "What happened?" she asked. I handed her the night logs, open to the page about room 303. Her expression darkened. "You went into 303, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "What's the deal with that room?" Claire hesitated before speaking. "The lodge has its stories. Guests checking out early, seeing things they shouldn't. Mr. Warwick keeps most of it under wraps, but you're not the first night manager to have a bad night. Did anyone?" I struggled to find the words. "Did anyone ever disappear?" Claire's face paled, and she glanced toward the stairwell. "They don't disappear," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They stay." I was desperate when I took the night shift job at Brier Textiles, a looming, decaying factory on the edge of town. Rent was overdue, and my savings had evaporated faster than I anticipated after graduation. The factory hadn't run at full capacity in years, but it was still functioning enough to hire night workers for minimal pay. On my first night, the air around the factory felt heavy and damp, reeking faintly of mildew and machine oil. The parking lot was a cracked slab of asphalt surrounded by overgrown weeds. I arrived early, hoping to make a good impression, but the building seemed deserted. Only one car was parked near the main entrance, a battered blue sedan with a broken taillight. Inside, the flickering fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, casting harsh shadows on the grime-covered walls. A man in a stained jumpsuit approached me, his face weathered and weary. "You're the new guy," he said, his voice gravelly. "Yes, sir," I replied, sticking out my hand. He didn't shake it. Instead, he handed me a clipboard and a flashlight. "Name's Frank. I'll show you around." The tour was brief. Brier Textiles was a maze of cavernous rooms filled with dormant machines and towering stacks of dusty fabric rolls. Frank explained my duties: routine checks of the machinery, monitoring the boiler room, and keeping an eye on the security cameras. "The cameras are old," he said as we passed the surveillance room, "so don't expect miracles. Sometimes they glitch, but you'll get used to it." I nodded, though his warning didn't inspire much confidence. The shift started smoothly. I walked through the factory, flashlight in hand, the echoes of my footsteps bouncing off the walls. The machines loomed like sleeping giants, their hulking shapes casting grotesque shadows. I checked gauges, took notes, and settled into a rhythm that made the hours blur together. Around 2 a.m., I was in the surveillance room, sipping stale coffee and scanning the monitors. The screens flickered, displaying grainy footage of various factory areas. Most of the rooms were empty, their stillness punctuated only by the occasional movement of a curtain swaying from a draft. Then, on camera 6, the hallway outside the break room, I saw it. A figure moved past the camera, just at the edge of the frame. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to jolt me upright. My mind raced. Was someone else here? Frank hadn't mentioned other night workers, and the building had been locked when I arrived. Grabbing the flashlight, I headed toward the break room. The hallway was empty when I got there, the silence oppressive. I opened the break room door and scanned the room with my light. Stale vending machines lined one wall, and a single chair sat crookedly at the table, but there was no sign of anyone. As I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. I whipped around, heart pounding, and yanked the door open. The hallway was still empty. I hurried back to the surveillance room, my mind a whirl of rationalizations. Maybe a draft had pushed the door shut. Maybe the camera glitch Frank mentioned had made me imagine the figure. When I glanced at the monitors again, my blood ran cold. On camera 9, which overlooked the boiler room, the figure was back. This time, it wasn't fleeting. It stood motionless, its dark silhouette stark against the dimly lit room. A burst of static disrupted the screen, and when the image cleared, the figure was gone. I stared at the screen, trying to steady my breathing. The boiler room was a good 5-minute walk from where I was, but the mere thought of going there filled me with dread. Still, I knew I couldn't just sit in the surveillance room and ignore it. I grabbed the flashlight and headed down the dimly lit corridors, the sound of my footsteps echoing eerily. As I approached the boiler room, the air grew colder, a stark contrast to the usual humid warmth from the machinery. The door to the boiler room creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the pipes hissed and groaned, releasing occasional bursts of steam. The room was vast and cluttered with a maze of valves and gauges, all coated in a thin layer of grime. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. There was no response, but the oppressive silence felt wrong, like the room was holding its breath. The flashlight's beam danced across the walls, illuminating corners where shadows seemed unnaturally deep. Then I saw it, a faint impression in the dust on the floor, like a footprint, and another, leading toward the far corner of the room. I followed the trail cautiously, my grip tightening on the flashlight. The footprint stopped abruptly at a spot near the old coal chute, a relic from when the factory had been powered by steam. The chute's hatch was slightly ajar, its darkness yawning like a mouth. I reached out hesitantly and pushed the hatch open wider. The air that escaped was cold and smelled faintly of earth. Shining my light inside, I saw nothing but a steep metal ladder leading down into darkness. A sudden clang echoed from somewhere behind me, and I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. The sound had come from the far side of the room, near the main boiler. "Who's there?" I demanded, though my voice lacked conviction. The shadows shifted as if alive, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement, a shape darting out of the corner of my vision. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the ambient noise of the room, but it grew louder, more insistent. Words I couldn't make out, a voice that wasn't quite human. I bolted. I didn't stop running until I reached the surveillance room, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. The monitors were still on, their flickering screens displaying the same grainy images of the factory. But something was wrong. On every screen, the same figure now stood. In the hallway, by the break room, in the surveillance room. I turned, the blood draining from my face. The figure stood in the corner, its form indistinct but undeniably there. A low, guttural sound filled the air, and the room seemed to tilt, the fluorescent lights flickering madly. I don't remember much after that. When I came to, it was daylight. Frank stood over me, his expression a mix of concern and annoyance. "Kid, what the hell happened? I found you passed out in here." I saw someone," I stammered. Sitting up, my head throbbed, and the events of the night rushed back in a chaotic blur. Frank sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Should have warned you about the boiler room, he muttered. This place has its quirks. Quirks? I echoed, my voice rising. Frank, there was someone here. He didn't reply, just handed me a bottle of water and helped me to my feet. I didn't last another shift. By the next day, I had quit, leaving Brier Textiles and its haunted halls behind. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that figure and wonder if it's still wandering those shadowed corridors, waiting for the next unlucky soul. If you like these stories, please support us by liking and subscribing. It helps me find more creepy stories for you. The warm scent of cinnamon and freshly baked bread greeted me as I stepped into Roscoe's bakery for my first day on the job. It was a quaint little place on the edge of town, with wide bay windows that caught the morning sun and cast golden light over the polished wooden floors. The owner, a cheerful older woman named Mrs. Roscoe, greeted me with a flurry of flour dust and a smile. "Welcome, Charlotte. Ready for your first shift?" she asked, tying an apron around her waist. "Absolutely," I replied, trying to mask my nervousness. Mrs. Roscoe walked me through the basics, taking orders, restocking the display cases, and keeping the counter tidy. She also introduced me to the night shift routine, which involved prepping dough for the morning crew and cleaning up once the bakery closed at 9 p.m. The first part of the day was uneventful, a comforting rhythm of customers coming and going, their laughter mixing with the clatter of dishes. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, I was feeling confident. Mrs. Roscoe handed me a set of keys as she packed up for the night. "You'll do great," she said. "It's just you and the bakery now. Call me if you need anything." After she left, the bakery felt different, quieter, almost too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old building were the only sounds. I busied myself with the tasks Mrs. Roscoe had outlined, rolling out dough on the long wooden counter and setting it aside to proof. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound growing louder as the minutes stretched into hours. Around 10:30 p.m., I was kneading dough when I heard the bell above the front door jingle. My heart skipped a beat. The bakery was closed, and I was sure I had locked the door after Mrs. Roscoe left. "Hello?" I called, peering toward the entrance. The display case reflected the warm light of the room, but I didn't see anyone. Cautiously, I walked to the door, my footsteps muffled by the rug. The door was firmly shut, the lock in place. I glanced outside, but the street was empty except for the dim glow of a street lamp and a stray cat darting into an alley. I shook my head, blaming my overactive imagination. Returning to the counter, I resumed kneading the dough. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping sound, like fingernails drumming against glass. I froze. The sound was coming from the back door, which led to the alley. Grabbing a rolling pin for some semblance of defense, I crept toward the rear of the bakery. The door's frosted window showed nothing but a faint outline of the alley beyond. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped, summoning what little courage I had. I unlocked the door and cracked it open. The alley was deserted, its narrow walls slick with moisture from an earlier rain. I closed the door quickly, bolting it this time, and decided to finish my shift as fast as possible. The sooner I was out of there, the better. Back in the kitchen, I tried to focus, but the oppressive silence of the bakery seemed to amplify every creak and rustle. I was folding dough into perfect shapes when the bell above the front door jingled again. This time, I knew I hadn't imagined it. I dropped the dough and grabbed the rolling pin again, my palms damp with sweat. The bell's jingle still echoed faintly in my ears as I crept toward the front of the bakery. "Hello?" I called out, forcing strength into my voice. No answer. The lights over the display case flickered slightly, and my reflection in the glass looked as startled as I felt. The front door was closed, and the street beyond was as empty as before. I stepped behind the counter, my eyes scanning every corner. My breath caught when I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. A faint trail of wet footprints leading from the door to the far corner of the bakery, where an old storage room sat unused. The footprints were small, as if made by bare feet, and they glistened under the light. "Who's there?" I demanded, gripping the rolling pin tighter. The storage room door was ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, as I forced myself to cross the room. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open wider. The storage room was empty, filled only with dusty shelves and a few cobwebs. But the air was different, cold and stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that made my stomach churn. As I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I screamed, fumbling for my flashlight app on my phone. When the light finally illuminated the room, I saw nothing out of place, except for a single set of damp footprints leading to the middle of the room and vanishing entirely. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dimly lit bakery beyond. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stumbled back to the main area, locking the storage room door behind me. I was done. I didn't care about finishing the shift or cleaning up. I grabbed my bag and headed for the front door. But as I reached for the lock, I froze. The reflection in the glass wasn't mine. It was a woman's face, pale and gaunt, with wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I turned to look behind me, but no one was there. When I faced the door again, the reflection was gone. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, finally managing to unlock the door. I bolted out into the street, not stopping until I was halfway down the block. Only then did I realize I had left my phone inside. I debated whether to go back, but couldn't summon the courage. Instead, I went to a nearby gas station, where the bright lights and steady hum of conversation calmed my nerves. I borrowed their phone to call Mrs. Roscoe. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice shaking as I recounted the events. There was a long pause on her end before she sighed. "You saw her, didn't you?" "What?" I asked, my skin crawling. "The woman. She's been here since the fire." I didn't know what to say, but Mrs. Roscoe continued. "This place used to be a boarding house before my father bought it. There was a fire decades ago, and some of the tenants didn't make it. She's the only one who's stayed. I never went back to the bakery after that night." Mrs. Roscoe was understanding, and she even mailed me my final paycheck. But sometimes, as I walk past that street, I swear I see someone standing in the bakery's window, watching. The Silver Pines Library stood on the edge of town, an imposing structure of red brick and iron-framed windows that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Its Gothic Revival architecture looked more suited to a cathedral than a library, with towering arches and grotesque gargoyles perched along the roof. I'd taken the job as the new night librarian because I needed the money and had convinced myself it would be an easy gig. How busy can a library get at night? I had joked during the interview. The head librarian, Mr. Graves, hadn't laughed. "Your duties are simple," he said. "Monitor the floors, reshelve books, and, most importantly, stay out of the archive basement. The door stays locked for a reason." I thought he was being melodramatic, but I nodded anyway. On my first night, I arrived at 10 p.m., greeted by the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of old paper. The library was deserted except for Mr. Graves, who handed me a ring of keys and a flashlight. "You'll be alone," he said. "Most nights it's quiet, but if you hear anything strange, just ignore it." Before I could ask what he meant, he left, the heavy oak doors creaking shut behind him. The first couple of hours were uneventful. I roamed the aisles, marveling at the sheer size of the place. The library had 4 sprawling floors, each packed with towering shelves. The top floor, with its vaulted ceiling and stained glass windows, was my favorite. By midnight, I was in the process of reshelving a cart of books on the second floor when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like pages turning. I paused, my ears straining. The library was supposed to be empty, but the sound persisted, soft and deliberate. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the aisles. No answer. I shrugged it off as the building settling and returned to my work. But the sound came again, this time closer. I turned, shining my flashlight down the darkened aisle, but saw nothing. Unease settled over me as I finished reshelving and headed to the main desk to check the logbook. The previous entries were sparse, mostly mundane notes about overdue books and scheduled repairs. But one entry stood out, dated 3 weeks prior. Strange occurrences reported near the archive basement. Staff advised to avoid. I glanced toward the staircase leading to the basement. The heavy iron door at the bottom was firmly shut, its padlock glinting faintly in the light. I tried to focus on my duties, but the quiet of the library felt oppressive now, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. At around 1:30 a.m., the lights flickered. I froze, my heart racing as the bulbs buzzed ominously. When the flickering stopped, I realized something was off. The archive basement door was ajar. I stared at it, my mind racing. Had I imagined locking it earlier? Surely I had. But the door now gaped open, revealing a yawning darkness beyond. Gathering my courage, I approached the staircase, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The air grew colder as I descended, and the faint smell of mildew and decay tickled my nose. "Is someone down there?" I called, my voice shaky. No response. I reached the door and peered inside. The beam of my flashlight illuminated rows of old shelves, their contents obscured by cobwebs and dust. But something glinted at the far end of the room, a faint, silvery light that pulsed faintly. The silvery light at the far end of the archive basement pulsed faintly, like the slow rhythm of a heartbeat. Every rational part of me screamed to turn around and bolt back upstairs, but curiosity and a strange pull drew me forward. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint sound of whispers tickled my ears. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as I neared the light, the whispers became clearer. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in a language that felt ancient and wrong, filled the room. The source of the light was an open book, lying on a pedestal at the center of the room. Its pages shimmered as if coated in silver leaf, and strange symbols seemed to shift and writhe on the paper. I reached out hesitantly, but the moment my fingers brushed the book, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I took a step back, heart hammering, and that's when I noticed it. A shadow on the wall, cast by no visible source. It was humanoid but distorted, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally. The shadow moved. I froze, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The shadow didn't belong to me, nor to anything else in the room. It slid across the wall, defying the beam of my flashlight, and stopped directly across from me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow stretched, elongating until it seemed to spill onto the floor, its form growing darker and more defined. It rose, taking on a three-dimensional shape that towered over me. I stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of old books and landing hard on the cold floor. The shadow thing loomed closer, its shape flickering like a flame caught in a breeze. A voice, low, guttural, and ancient, filled the room. "You should not have come." I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and bolted for the stairs. The air around me felt heavy, almost solid, as if something unseen was trying to hold me back. I reached the staircase, each step feeling like wading through quicksand. Behind me, the voice grew louder. "You cannot leave now." I didn't dare look back. Bursting into the main library, I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The library was eerily silent, the oppressive air lingering. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was stuck at 2:17 a.m., the second hand twitching but not moving forward. Grabbing my things, I sprinted to the front doors, fumbling with the keys. The lock wouldn't turn, no matter how hard I tried. A faint tapping sound drew my attention. I turned slowly, my stomach sinking as I saw the shadow thing standing in the center of the library. It was darker now, more solid, its edges pulsating like ink spreading through water. Its head tilted as it spoke, the words resonating deep in my chest. "You belong to us now." With a final, desperate effort, I threw my weight against the door, and it burst open. I stumbled onto the street, gasping for air as the cold night wind hit my face. When I looked back, the library stood dark and silent, its windows reflecting the moonlight. I never returned to Silver Pine's library. When I called Mr. Graves the next morning to quit, his only response was a weary sigh. "You saw them, didn't you?" I didn't answer, but he continued. "They've been here since the library was built. Be glad you got out. Some don't. Even now, I can't walk past the library without feeling a cold chill run down my spine. And at night, in my quiet apartment, I sometimes see shadows moving where there shouldn't be any." I always loved antique shops, the smell of old wood, the sense of history clinging to every object. So when I saw a "Help Wanted" sign in the window of Alcott's timepieces, I didn't think twice before stepping inside. The shop was tucked into a forgotten corner of the city, its windows cluttered with clocks of every size and style. Inside, the air was thick with the tick-tock of dozens of timepieces, their rhythms overlapping in a strangely hypnotic symphony. An old man emerged from behind the counter, his silver hair neatly combed and his glasses perched low on his nose. "You're here for the job?" he asked, his voice soft but commanding. "Yes, sir," I replied, suddenly nervous under his piercing gaze. He studied me for a long moment before nodding. "We'll try you out. You'll start tonight." That should have been my first warning sign. Who starts a job the same night they're hired? But I was broke and eager, so I agreed. The job seemed simple enough. Assist Mr. Alcott in maintaining the clocks and ensuring the shop was secure after hours. "And one more thing," he said, his tone grave as he handed me a brass key. "Do not touch the grandfather clock in the back room. Leave it alone." I nodded, not daring to ask why. By the time Mr. Alcott left for the night, the city had quieted, and the shop felt like a world unto itself. The ticking of the clocks filled the air, a steady cadence that seemed almost alive. I spent the first hour dusting shelves and inspecting the smaller clocks for damage. The back room loomed in the corner of my vision, its door slightly ajar. I tried not to look at it, but my curiosity gnawed at me. Finally, I gave in. The back room was dimly lit, its only source of light a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. At its center stood the grandfather clock, an imposing structure of dark wood and gleaming brass. Its face was ornate, with Roman numerals carved in intricate detail. The hands of the clock were stuck at 11:58. I stared at it, mesmerized. There was something unsettling about the way the pendulum hung motionless, as if frozen in time. A sharp knock on the front door startled me. I hurried back to the main room, but when I peered outside, the street was empty. Shrugging it off, I returned to my tasks. But as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The clocks on the shelves started to slow, their ticking growing faint and uneven. A cold draft swept through the shop, carrying the faint scent of something metallic. And then, I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound coming from the back room. The grandfather clock was chiming. The sound of the grandfather clock chiming sent a shiver down my spine. I was sure it hadn't been working earlier. Its hands had been frozen at 11:58. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to leave it alone. But the eerie, resonant chimes seemed to draw me toward the back room. With the flashlight from my pocket, I slowly pushed the door open. The clock was alive. Its pendulum swung rhythmically, casting long shadows across the room. The hands on the clock face moved at an impossible speed, spinning around and around as if time itself had lost its meaning. And then it stopped. The hands froze at exactly 12 o'clock, and the room plunged into silence. The air grew thick, pressing against my chest, and the faint scent of smoke and old wood filled my nostrils. A creaking sound made me whip around, and my flashlight flickered. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, tall, gaunt, and shrouded in shadow. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a single step forward, and I realized it wasn't a person at all. Its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. The clock began to chime again, louder this time, each note reverberating through my chest. The figure moved closer, its shadow stretching across the floor like spilled ink. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I tried to find the door. My hand found the edge of the frame, and I bolted back into the main shop, slamming the door shut behind me. The ticking of the other clocks had stopped entirely. The shop was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive. I grabbed my phone to call Mr. Alcott, but the screen was glitching, lines of static cutting across it. Desperation clawed at me as I slammed my hand on the counter. "You were warned." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, deep and resonant, like the grinding of ancient gears. I turned slowly, and the grandfather clock was there, standing in the middle of the main room. It hadn't been moved, it couldn't have been, but it was undeniably in front of me. The shadow figure emerged from behind it, its form impossibly tall, its eyeless face staring down at me. The clock's hands began to spin again, faster and faster, until they were a blur. The air grew heavier, pressing me to my knees, and the shop around me seemed to fade, replaced by swirling darkness. "Your time is mine now," the voice intoned. With the last of my strength, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass key Mr. Alcott had given me. I didn't know what else to do, so I held it out toward the clock. The reaction was immediate. The shadow figure recoiled, its form dissolving into wisps of smoke. The clock's hands froze, and the oppressive air lifted. When I came to, I was outside the shop, sitting on the cold sidewalk. The sun was rising, casting its light over the quiet street. Mr. Alcott found me there, his face grim. "I told you not to touch it," he said, helping me to my feet. "What is that thing?" I demanded, my voice hoarse. He sighed, his eyes heavy with regret. "It's not a clock," he said. "It's a prison, and you nearly let it out." I quit that day, leaving the shop and its cursed secrets behind. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I hear the faint ticking of a clock that isn't there, and I wonder if I truly escaped.